government money.
Washington Journal continues.
Our guest, Representative Jerry Moran of Kansas, talk a little bit about what your thinking is on Guantanamo detainees and where they should end up.
Well, we should have a debate about what happens at Guantanamo, whether it should be closed. At the moment, it's a bit different discussion, I think, in Congress. That is, there is no plan. So there's a discussion about what happens at Guantanamo Bay, whether it should continue to exist or whether it should be closed. That's a debate that needs to occur. At the moment, the president's already decided that Guantanamo Bay should be closed. We have the emergency supplemental before us tomorrow, before us this week, and the discussion has been whether or not there should be money in there to close Guantanamo Bay. And I think many of us are saying, before we make that decision, Mr. President, let's know what you intend to do with the prisoners, with the detainees, with the terrorists that are being held at Guantanamo. This becomes a Kansas issue because Fort Leavenworth, just kind of northwest of Kansas City, which is known as a prison community, has become, at least by rumor, perhaps by fact, that it is a potential location for these detainees. While I don't really think this is a not in my backyard attitude by Fort Leavenworth or by Kansas, I think this really is a realization that the facilities are not structured. The kind of minimum medium security prison facility that is there for the military is not something that would work well for detainees. And so Kansans, and particularly those who live in northeast Kansas who know Fort Leavenworth well, are saying, not here. And so there's a general discussion just about what we ought to do. And then from a Kansas perspective, there's a specific idea that we want to be helpful. We're not trying to discourage things from happening. But those who just stereotypically think that Fort Leavenworth is the place that prisoners ought to be, that's not the answer. And for a number of reasons. It's a facility in which families of soldiers live at Fort Leavenworth. There's not a real segregated area. It's the home of the General Command and Staff College, which means we have our own military trained there. But many foreign members of the military come to Fort Leavenworth for training. And the idea of having very politically difficult circumstance with prisoners at Fort Leavenworth perhaps destroys the mission of Fort Leavenworth in training soldiers, military men and women from around the world.
Should there be a new type of facility built?
At least if it's going to be, certainly the facility that exists at Fort Leavenworth is not satisfactory for this purpose. And potentially, I suppose, I don't know whether those facilities exist in the United States. At the moment, I think what we're waiting on is something from the administration that says this is the plan. And I think the president was, in my estimation, President Obama, the administration was premature in simply announcing it's closed. 1 year from now, it will not exist. And my guess is that they have discovered what a difficult task it is now to fill the role that Guantanamo has played during the War on Terror.
Should the United States be the chief receptor of Guantanamo detainees?
Well, in the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, the War on Terror has been a global effort, and I think it's a burden that can be shared around the world. But I would guess that as the war in Iraq and Afghanistan have been primarily ours, the burden has fallen to Americans more so than anybody else. We probably have the responsibility of resolving this issue. And again, maybe we can find facilities, locations, countries around the world that are willing to host this facility, these detainees, the terrorists. But if that doesn't happen, and my guess is that's a difficult task to accomplish, then it does become very much a United States responsibility. And the question ought to be, is Guantanamo Bay the best option? Was the administration premature in reaching the conclusion that Guantanamo Bay should be closed?
As our guest will be with us for 20 more minutes, and if you want to ask him questions about this topic, it's 202-737-0002 for Democrats, 202-737-0001 for Republicans, and 202-628-0205 for Independents. Our guest serves the 1st District of Kansas. You're running for Senate?
That's true. Senator Brownback, our senior senator from Kansas, is not seeking re-election, and so there's an open seat in Kansas in 2010, and I have filed for that office.
As far as a plan is concerned, what do you think makes up a good plan in your mind?
Well,
knowing that the administration has put out their version, but what should be included in your mind?
That's the problem, I think, is the administration has not put out their version. Their version is close Guantanamo Bay and we'll figure out what to do. We're at that point in which, before we close Guantanamo Bay, let's know what we're going to do. And I think it involves certainly not only the housing, the facility for having these detainees secured, but also what's the process by which detainees are tried, given some level of due process, are given the opportunity to make their case. And again, one of the suggestions that seems to be developing, in fact, the rumors are from administration sources that the Obama administration will announce this week a plan for the return of the military commissions that Congress approved nearly 2 years ago. It came about as a result of the U.S. Supreme Court determining some unconstitutionality of the way detainees were being treated, particularly Senator McCain, Senator Graham fashioned legislation to address that constitutional issue. That commission process was put in place but really never used, and at least the story coming from the administration reported by the press is that those commissions will now be utilized. And so, I think there's really two issues when you talk about a plan. One is what's the legal proceedings that need to take place to resolve the status of these individuals, and secondly, many of them are still going to need to be secured from the rest of society, and we've seen anecdotally and otherwise evidence that those who have been released have returned to attempt to kill Americans, particularly in Afghanistan, work with the Taliban. And so the second part of that plan has to be, all right, some people need to be secured. Where?
Newville, Indiana, on our Republican line, we hear from Vinny. Good morning.
Good morning, and thank you for C-SPAN. I really appreciate that. I'm sitting here, and I constantly get confused with so much debate on what to do with prisoners. If in World War II we were fighting the Germans, and when you captured a German soldier, you held them until the war was over and you released them. According to what I'm hearing with this war on terror, this endless war on terror, that means that we're going to have to keep these people indefinitely. You certainly can't bring them to America and treat them as American citizens with their rights because they're not Americans. And the catch is they didn't have a uniform on, so they weren't fighting for a particular group. My idea is we could all invite them over to Nancy Pelosi's house, and we could give them welfare, and we could even release them into Mexico, and then they could come back across the border, and Pelosi could say that they're good citizens. My idea, and I know this sounds very barbaric, is you put them to death. When you fight an American soldier and you point a gun at him, we have to kill the enemy. And I don't think it's barbaric, since in this country we allow billions of people to be aborted in abortion clinics, and we don't call that murder. Why don't we just put them to death? And I'm not trying to be sarcastic. I mean that.
The idea that they're not U.S. citizens is clearly true. The idea that this is an ongoing war is clearly true. It's different, I think. Kansas housed prisoners during World War II. They were brought to the United States. We still have the remnants of those prisons in our state where POWs were held. The question here is, I think, that there is a process that needs to take place in which their guilt of their activities is determined. And again, I don't think we want to hold people indefinitely until some court, and I don't think it's a U.S. Court. It's not our procedure here in the United States. It's not involved the United States Constitution in how these prisoners are tried. It involves, in my mind, the utilization of a military court that takes into account these acts occurred while the country was at war. And these are military combatants.
Eagle River, Wisconsin. Ronald on our Democrats line.
Yes, good morning.
Good morning.
I'd like to ask the representative if, for one thing, after listening to the last guy, some of these people, they're prisoners. They've never been to court. They've never, we have no idea what their part is. In a lot of cases. Also, we have maximum prisons in this country for the worst people that live amongst us in this country. I mean, they're in cells, for 23 hours a day. They don't get nothing, And I would like to know why, if we can do it in this country, we can't, bring these same prisoners and put them in max prisons. Thank you.
Certainly agree with the concept of the caller that there needs to be some determination. In fact, that was my response to the earlier caller, is there needs to be a process that we as Americans do not want to hold people indefinitely without some determination at some independent level. Again, in my view, this military commission seems to be the best option to determine whether or not individuals should be held. So there needs to be some determination about what acts they committed and what threat they are to the United States, and if they were released, what it would mean to the safety and security of Americans. And then there probably are facilities within the United States. You asked that question of me earlier, in which we hold very dangerous people today. I think from a perspective of a Kansan representing folks who care a lot about the future of Fort Leavenworth, it's not the facility. It's not one of those maximum security facilities that our caller's talking about. And then the question becomes the magnitude. 241 people is the number I believe are currently being held. It is believed that some will be released. It's believed that some will be determined, will go through some kind of trial process. And at least what I know and read tells me that some of those people will need to be detained. And the question is, do you put a large percentage of 241 people in the same facility? That may not exist in the United States, but you probably have space and opportunity for a few individuals within our maximum security prisons within the United States. Again, the question, I think, Guantanamo Bay became an image issue for the United States. And I think maybe there's things that could be done that clear up the image around the world about what Guantanamo Bay is and what it does. Members of Congress, and I'm not one of them, who have visited Guantanamo Bay, come back and report to me and others about the nature of the place, and it's reports that are pleasing from a kind of an American standard perspective. And so the question becomes, what may be wrong? Is there something wrong with just working to make sure that Guantanamo Bay works in the kind of way that it does today and cleans up the image issue that the United States had with Guantanamo? And I think that President Bush was interested in closing Guantanamo Bay and moving the prisoners out. Again, I think it had to do with the image of that place and its effect upon our relations around the world.
For those who don't know, how did Fort Leavenworth become part of this discussion?
Because Fort Leavenworth is known as a military prison. There are several other locations across the country that seem to be talked about. I've not seen any official document that says Fort Leavenworth is the place that we're thinking about. There is, as I understand it, the administration is working its way through potential opportunities of facilities in the United States, and the belief is that Fort Leavenworth is on the list. And I think, again, it's there because we are known throughout history as a military prison, and the belief, it stereotypically fits with maybe what we're trying to do. And I suppose that as a Kansan, it's somewhat troublesome to me that there's this stereotype that, well, send them to Kansas. It's flat and secure and not many people. That's certainly not the case with the part of Kansas that Fort Leavenworth exists in. It's really in a metropolitan area. So for just a number of reasons, it makes little sense. Came on the list, I think, because people are desperately looking for a place.
On our independent line, Peter from Inverness, Florida.
Good morning.
Good morning, Peter.
The previous caller said the same things that I was going to say, so I'll just give up my time. Thank you.
Annapolis, Maryland, we hear from Steve on our Republican line.
Hello, thank you for C-SPAN, and Congressman Moran, thank you for your service to our country. I'm a former Democrat. I became a Democrat at age 10, I suppose, and voted for George McGovern and was a enthusiastic Clintonite, so forth. But over the last 8 years, I became rather dismayed with the policy put forward by the Democratic leadership and also the attitude. So I recently changed my registration to independent and then decided to become a Republican. But that's by way of background. What I really wanted to say, Congressman, is that back in the early part of the Bush administration, President Bush had to make a decision about use of embryonic stem cells. And he seemed as if he put a lot of thought into it, and then came before the public on television and gave a what I thought was a rather reasoned speech. Whether you agree or disagree, you could agree or disagree with it, but at least he put out the both the pluses and the minuses, I think, for both sides. And I think that's what President Obama owes the country now on this subject, a reasoned, for whatever decision he makes, unlike what he just did by just making a snap decision, he needs to give the public a reasoned discussion of his thought process. And
that makes a lot of sense to me. I remember the speech of President Bush. It's one of those speeches I do remember about the president sitting there and talking to the American people about the science and ethics of stem cell research. And that is, I think, what this issue deserves. This issue is so important that it cannot simply be a political bone thrown to political supporters. It deserves thought and attention. And it's always useful when elected officials go through the rationale. And in many cases, they can convince us that they're right, and sometimes they make us more skeptical. But it's the kind of discussion that didn't occur with the decision to simply close Guantanamo Bay. It's the kind of discussion that should occur with the administration, Congress, the American people, about what should happen now. Again, I would take a step back and say, we need to evaluate the question of whether Guantanamo Bay should be closed and go through the thought process that reaches the right conclusion there, one that is defensible. But as part of that announcement, it's the reason we can close Guantanamo Bay is because we have A, B, and C as the options to replace Guantanamo Bay. And that's what we've not heard, and that's, I think, certainly my complaint. I'm certainly willing to be convinced that the facility in Cuba should be closed. I want to hear that discussion, but I think that discussion is a false one until you have the replacement, the plan in place, and that's what's missing in this debate.
Is there any sense that a plan is forthcoming on that?
No rumors or discussion that I know of. Again, expectation is that the president may make some announcement about military commissions this week, but I've yet to hear anybody speak to the fact that here is now what we're going to do. And the president gave himself, his administration, a year to tell us what to do. The problem is the appropriations process is in play now. In the House version of the supplemental appropriation, which generally deals with the funding of the war on terror, Iraq and Afghanistan, additional monies needed for that purpose. In the House version, the chairman, Mr. Obey, has removed the $80 million that was in there for purposes of closing Guantanamo Bay under the theory that, as I heard what he said was, I don't want to have to defend this if there's no plan. I'll defend it if you give me the options. And so in the House version of the bill, the money's not there. Senator Reid and the appropriators in the Senate have announced that there is money in the Senate bill, but it's going to be what they, I guess, called walled off, secured until there is a plan in place. So this issue is not one that can wait for a year because the appropriations process is ongoing now, and members of Congress, American people, are looking for some answers.
We have about 7 more minutes with our guest, Kendallville, Indiana. France is on our Democrats line.
Good morning. I'm a great-grandma, and I'm scared to death, and I'm going to tell you exactly why. And thank you for having C-SPAN let people like me call in, because I'm just a little person in northeastern Indiana. But I got an email yesterday, and after I saw it, I wrote a letter to President Obama this morning, and I'm going to tell you about this email. In North Carolina, there was a 15-year-old boy that was taken under the U.S. Patriot Act and put in a prison in my state, Indiana. They interviewed his mother. It was on the news. And if you go to brasschecktv.com/page 618, you can see the actual news reporting. Under the U.S. Patriot Act, they did this. And no one knows and no one's talking. And I want President Obama to do something about this. I am scared to death. And I'll tell you what, only one senator voted against that act. Senator Russell Feingold from Wisconsin, and thank you, Senator Russell Feingold. The U.S. Patriot Act is being used on USA citizens.
I don't know the story of which the caller calls in about, but I'd be happy to look at it myself and see what she's talking about. The Patriot Act has been, I think there's a a consensus, I believe this at least to be the case, that following 9/11, based upon the emotion that occurred with the death of hundreds of Americans on 9/11 and an uncertainty as to whether we were going to be attacked soon, Congress passed the Patriot Act. I think there's a general belief that at that moment Congress may have exceeded the law may have exceeded what needed to be done, and there's been a number of attempts to take a step back. I'm a bit of a libertarian on these issues and worry a lot about the role that government can play in lives. I want to protect our liberty. It's about finding the right balance of security and protecting the liberties on which our country is based. And so the Patriot Act has been refined. Obviously not to the extent that this caller suggests it needs to be, and I guess her point is that no one should have voted for it. But again, we're trying to find the right balance that protects Americans and from those who want to kill us. They exist today. I mean, in my mind, there's no question but what we live in a very unsecure world. There are plenty of organizations and individuals around the world who would like to see the death of Americans, and we need to find the tools, particularly using tools abroad. Intelligence is the most important component of protecting ourselves. And so we need to have a sense of what's going on. At the same time, we absolutely must protect the civil liberties of Americans. And again, I don't know the story of the 15-year-old, but I'll see what I can find out.
When is it up for renewal, the Patriot Act?
I don't know. We've had votes on the Patriot Act. Seems like most years I've been in Congress, mostly changes in trying to amend it. And we extended it the House extended it for a shorter period of time. The Senate extended it for a longer period of time, and I don't remember those dates.
Round Rock, Texas, Kermit, Independent Line.
Yes, good morning, gentlemen.
Good morning.
It's a pleasure to speak to you, Representative. I just have a question. I may have missed it, but I know a previous caller had asked what your plan would be if you were to close Guantanamo, and so that's my first question. And my second question is, when that facility was opened, it appears to me that there was no plan to close it, and I'm just curious as to what we were ever thinking about we were going to do with these people. I mean, we bring them here, and of course many of them were purchased by warlords, and they all had different circumstances, but it was clear that Guantanamo couldn't go on forever, so what was the plan earlier? And thank you very much.
Thank you very much. The answer to what is my plan? My plan, I think, again, I'm looking for the administration who's made the decision to close Guantanamo Bay. What is their plan? But in the absence of that, what I would think is that Guantanamo Bay becomes the facility that remains, and we do things to make certain that the process that occurs at Guantanamo Bay protects the human rights of people who are there. There's a process in place. Again, military commissions seem to me to be the best answer to determine whether or not they should be there and whether they should be released. In my opinion, you have to have a process in which people have their, quote, day in court. Again, not necessarily a court in the United States, but some process by which an independent judge makes a determination about these so-called military combatants. And the original plan for Guantanamo Bay, I think, was that there would be this process by which they were tried. Those who were convicted would be housed, probably at Guantanamo Bay for the term of their sentence. And those who were not found to be a threat to the United States and had not committed acts of terror against Americans would be released to their home countries. And that's been part of what's gone on in Guantanamo Bay already, is that a number of detainees have been released to their home countries. Some have been released to Saudi Arabia and other Middle East countries for a reintegration program. So there is process that's ongoing with some of the folks, the individuals, those who were believed to be terrorists at Guantanamo.
One more call, Plano, Texas, on a Republican line. We hear from Patty.
Hi, Senator. It's nice to speak to somebody from Kansas. I was born and raised there.
Very good. Happy to talk to a native.
Thank you. No, I was just wondering, with all of the hullabaloo over Guantanamo, what is wrong with using one of these bases that have been closed over the last 20 years? The facilities are there. All they'd have to do is go in and make it more secure. And we're going to have these detainees here for years, I suspect, so they might as well put them someplace here that's good and secure, get them out of Guantanamo. since that seems to be the big issue with the Obama administration. I'll take your answer offline. Thank you.
Thank you.